What's up everybody, the Game 2K2 here again, and today I'm taking a look at the popular Fast and Furious franchise. Naturally, to do a franchise review we have to start from the beginning, so let's start with 2001's The Fast and the Furious. The story centers around an undercover officer named Brian O'Connor who is out to help arrest the people responsible for robbing several semi-trucks. The people responsible turn out to be a very tight group of friends led by Dominic Toretto. The group is also involved in street racing, which is what O'Connor uses to gain Toretto's trust. But O'Connor has trouble doing his job after he starts falling in love with Toretto's sister Mia. It's not the most realistic story in the world. In fact, some of it is pretty outrageous. The element that really attracted me to The Fast and the Furious was that it did tell a good story about friendship and trust. I like to call this the Goonie effect. I'm not really trying to be funny because what I mean is, despite the fact that we've only just met these characters, we actually do feel that Dominic and his group are childhood friends, because more often than not, movies tend to fail at making the audience feel that. So it's always nice when a movie actually does accomplish that. I also love the love story between Brian and Mia. Most love stories in movies directed towards the younger audiences usually don't pan out too well, especially when the writers are not young themselves, so the love stories tend to take a cliché turn in a very non-cliché movie. Surprisingly, The Fast and Furious manages to avoid all of this, and the love story actually becomes a really great part of the movie. Like I said before, some of this story is pretty outrageous and unrealistic. Even though Brian is an undercover cop, the way it's handled is far from realistic, especially when it comes to the police meetings shown throughout the film. The races are also a little outrageous. The first 10-second race in the movie is about 3 minutes long, but to its credit, it's a very entertaining 3 minutes. However, there are some very legitimate flaws with this film. One of the biggest flaws is the movie's weak dialogue. The movie obviously was not intended for a very old audience, but some of the dialogue doesn't seem to be written for anybody to really get or take seriously. A lot of the car dialogue, particularly Dominic's jokes towards Brian after their first race, is not even close to being funny because they aren't normal jokes that a sane human being would say. The moment that I have the biggest problem with is Dominic explaining how racing sets him free. For some reason, that scene just seemed really out of place for a movie like this, and I find myself fast-forwarding through that scene every time I watch the movie. Another scene that seemed kind of out of place is the interrogation scene between Dominic and Brian. It's not a terrible scene, it just seemed to depart from the tone that the rest of the movie had. The acting is good in some areas, but falls flat in the rest. I think the two best performances was Paul Walker as Brian and Jordana Brewster as Mia. Vin Diesel plays Dominic, and Vin Diesel at the time was still trying to establish himself as an actor, and his performance is not terrible, but it's not good either. Diesel is not much of a dramatic actor, and those flaws do show in the movie, because he does struggle in some of the more dramatic elements of the movie. The only bright side is that there aren't many of them. The only other notable performance I can think of is Tom Berry as Bilkins. He was very good. The rest falls very flat, and on that note we start with Michelle Rodriguez as Letty. Rodriguez is not quite in the same category as Jessica Alba because Rodriguez has actually displayed some good acting in her more recent roles, whereas Jessica Alba just seems to get worse with every role. However, I say recent roles because her earlier roles, like this one, are downright terrible. She tries to pull off the badass girlfriend role, which doesn't work at all. The rest of the cast chosen for Dominic's gang is just flat out terrible. Chad Lindbergh as Jesse, Matt Schultz as Vince, and Johnny Strong as Leon is like watching high school acting on the big screen. Same goes for Rick Yune as Johnny Tran. He's awful. So overall, The Fast and the Furious is not exactly an Oscar contender, but it's very entertaining, and some elements of the story do save it from falling to the ground. Now we move on to Too Fast, Too Furious. After The Fast and the Furious became one of the more surprising box office successes in 2001, a sequel was immediately planned to capitalize on the success. The story follows the character of Brian, who is on the run after letting Dominic go in the first movie. He is now a street racer who is literally traveling around the entire country, but is eventually caught by the police. His old boss then agrees to let him go if he does one last mission, and that's to stop a drug lord in Miami. and Brian requests that an old friend helps him named Roman. I'm going to try to keep this review very short, because if I talk about this movie too much, I'm going to scream my head off. Needless to say, I hate Too Fast, Too Furious. Have you ever wanted to see a Miami Vice movie on steroids? Well, besides the actual Miami Vice movie. Because that's literally what this movie is, which makes it not only weird, but also makes it everything but what the first movie was. My first problem is with director John Singleton. First of all, I don't dislike all of Singleton's work. He has done some really good work. I like Poetic Justice, and I consider Boys in the Hood to be a classic and the best of his career. However, Singleton has one huge flaw in a lot of his most recent work, and that is stereotyping his characters. Too Fast, Too Furious is not the only one. Baby Boy is another good example. The first movie, as flawed as it was, gave the characters enough personality to make them believable. They weren't just street racers, there was a story behind them. I don't get that from any of the new characters. They either have no personality, or in some cases, like Tyrese Gibson's character Roman, way too much personality to hold in one movie. Besides that, the story could not be any further from the first movie. The first film's story was actually pretty simple, while this one seemed to be written for a completely different movie. The first movie wasn't just an undercover cop story, it was a story of friendship, while this movie is purely an undercover cop story with a little bit of racing thrown in between. And on that note, we go into the racing, which lacks magic due to the fact that they overload it with CG, which ruins it. The acting only has one positive, and that's the returning Paul Walker, who gives a fairly decent performance. Tyrese Gibson, while a very improved actor now, was not so good back then. In fact, if I had the ability to mute his voice throughout this film, I would. Then there's Eva Mendes as Monica Fuentes, and Mendes is actually a pretty good actress, and to her credit, unlike most of the new cast, she does try. But unfortunately plays a character that is obviously written to be nothing but eye candy to the male audience than actually being a good character, so she doesn't have much to work with. Then of course there's Cole Hauser as Carter Verone, who is the villain in the film, and remember what I said about stereotypes? His character falls into that category as well. Hauser's performance doesn't help either. And the last that I'll mention on this list is Ludacris as TJ, and to his credit, his hair does some great acting. Okay, so overall, Too Fast, Too Furious is just terrible. The direction stinks, the story stinks, and the movie doesn't even attempt to bring back even a quarter of the charm that the first film had. Okay, now we move on to Tokyo Drift. Well, Too Fast, Too Furious was not exactly the best received. Big shocker. It was a big box office success, and naturally another film was set to release. But a new director would be brought in named Justin Lin. The story centers around a new main character, Sean, who gets into trouble at home after racing a rich kid from his school, and he's sent to live with his father, who lives in Tokyo. He is told to stay away from cars and racing, but just can't seem to do it. But it also gets him in trouble with a man known as DK, which stands for Drift King, which is a new racing style introduced in the film. He also befriends a man named Han, who teaches him how to drift, and a girl named Neela, who he becomes attracted to, and it's that relationship that gets him into even more trouble with DK. One of the big differences between Tokyo Drift and the first couple movies is that Tokyo Drift is a lot more story-driven, and for the most part, I love the story. It introduces more dramatic elements, while also managing to maintain the outrageously entertaining elements of the first movie as well. Like the first film, it's a story of friendship and trust that really drives the main story, and that element works out perfectly. I like the movie's characters, and I like the stories behind the characters. Each of the main characters have a past, and while we don't learn in detail about some of them, we still feel like we know these characters regardless. My favorite character is Han, because every time you think you figure him out in the movie, they always add another twist to him. Then there's the villain DK, whose actual name in the movie is Takashi, who actually worked out a lot better than I was expecting. The first couple scenes didn't really show him off too well, because it made him look a bit cliché, but the character did get better as the movie went on. Another good element of the film is, of course, the racing. Unlike John Singleton, Justin Lin really focused on keeping all the races live action, with a few exceptions. When they first mentioned drifting when the film was in production, I didn't think it was going to work very well, because they were going from the very fast-paced racing of the first two films to a more slower racing form of drifting. So it almost sounded like it was a step backwards, but it winds up being one of the highlights of the film. It's just really amazing to see racers able to pull off those stunts in those cars. There is one element of the film that I didn't particularly care for, and it was surprisingly the love story. The first film managed to avoid all the cliches with its storyline, while this film doesn't quite manage to do the same. For me, it was Neela's character that bugged me the most, because she was given a complete polar opposite character to Mia and Letty in the first film, and Monica in the second film. She was given the more damsel in distress storyline, the girl that loves one guy but is trapped with a man that she doesn't love. If this were another movie, it would have worked, but it seems out of place in this franchise. Another slight flaw with the film revolves around the acting. Unfortunately, the worst of it comes from our star, Lucas Black, who plays Sean in the film. He is unbelievably stiff in this movie. He doesn't do a good job acting out the more emotional scenes, and his voice, no matter what the scene is, never seems to change in tone, which doesn't help. Hung Sang as Han gives, in my opinion, the best performance of the movie. He performs both the comedic and dramatic scenes very well. Natalie Kelly as Neela is also very good, especially considering it was her very first movie. While I don't like the character, I do like her performance. I also like Brian T. as DK. While he does get a bit over the top in the movie, he does play the villain role very well. Another performance that really surprised me was Bow Wow. He surprisingly performs very well, and it's one of the first roles that I actually began to respect him as an actor. So overall, Load's better than Too Fast, Too Furious, and is actually just as good, if not better, than the first film. While there still are a couple flaws, Tokyo Drift still hits almost every note right.